Hi everyone, yasas kakalosirtate to another episode of Dimitra's Dishes. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to make an Esterhazy torte. This is a Hungarian cake that's kind of like a hazelnut cream cake. There's layers of hazelnut sponge cake, such a creamy, rich buttercream frosting. It's beautiful because there's a feathered topping, a feathered icing, or an icing with a feathered decoration on top, just like Napoleon's. If you followed my step-by-step instructions, you can make this for any special occasion. Let's get started. Okay, we're gonna begin by making the hazelnut layer cake. So hazelnuts can be very expensive. If they are, or if you can't find them this time of year, you can substitute almonds for this. You're just gonna wanna toast the almonds or the hazelnuts, whatever you're using, until they're nice and fragrant at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 7 minutes or until they become fragrant, like I said before. And today I'm using 1.5 cups of hazelnuts, that's 220 grams. As soon as they come out of the oven, I'm gonna transfer them to a clean kitchen towel and then just rub them together to help as much of the skin come off as possible. The skin tends to be a little bit bitter. Let them cool down and then I'll transfer them into my food processor with 1/4 cup of breadcrumbs that are unseasoned. And then I'll just pulse them a few times until they're finely ground and look like this. You don't want to take it too far because then the hazelnuts will start releasing their oils and you'll have a hazelnut butter instead of a flour like this. So this is going to go in a bowl with a heaping tablespoon of all-purpose flour and a heaping tablespoon of cornstarch, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and then this is going to get mixed up with also a little pinch of salt, just 1/4 teaspoon. Whisk that all together and set it aside. Next, we're going to separate 6 large eggs. I'll put the egg whites in my mixing bowl and the egg yolks in another little bowl, and then we're going to make the meringue. So attach the whisk attachment to your mixer and start whipping the egg whites, and once they start to get a little bit frothy, add 1/2 cup of sugar to them and let them whip at high speed until a thick meringue is formed, just like this. Transfer that to another bowl. Unless you have another mixing bowl for your mixer, then you could just leave that and just put another mixing bowl on there. Add the egg yolks to the mixing bowl with another 1/2 cup of granulated sugar and beat them on high speed until the mixture is nice and thick and pale yellow. At this point, we'll lighten up the mixture with some of the whites that we whisked up before, and I'm going to keep adding the whites in a little bit at a time until they're incorporated and we have a nice light mixture ready. Next, we're going to add the hazelnut flour to this a little bit at a time, just fold it in. You can also use the whisk to help you. We're not too worried about deflating the eggs because we added the teaspoon of baking powder to this, so it'll still rise. Once the batter is ready, it's going to go in a 1/2 sheet baking pan that's lined with parchment paper. I also sprayed it with some baking spray. I'll spread this batter evenly across the pan. My oven is preheated to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to bake for about 18 minutes or until it's golden and fully cooked. As soon as it comes out of the oven, I'm just going to run a knife all around the cake to release it from the pan, set it aside to cool completely, and we're going to make the buttercream next. So I've made pastry cream so many times on this channel. I'll put the link down below on how to make it. We only need 1.5 cups of pastry cream. So again, I'll put the link down below and the instructions will also be written on the blog post for this. I didn't record that part. So we have 1.5 cups of pastry cream here. In my mixing bowl, I'm going to add 1/2 pound of unsalted butter that's at room temperature. It's very important that both the pastry cream and the butter are at room temperature. If the pastry cream is hot, it's going to melt the butter and you're not going to get a buttercream. It's just going to be a big oily mess. And if the pastry cream is cold and we add it to the room temperature butter, it's just going to seize up and not become creamy. So that step is very important. So I'm also going to add 1/2 cup of confectioner sugar, 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract, and 1 teaspoon of pure almond extract to my mixing bowl with a little pinch of salt. And I'll beat the butter with all of these ingredients until it's nice and fluffy. Once the butter looks like this, we're going to go in and add the pastry cream a little bit at a time, mixing it on high speed so it's nice and fluffy and creamy. And then we're going to have a delicious buttercream ready just like this. I'm going to set this aside and now we'll assemble the cake. I'm going to dust some powdered sugar all over the top of the cake because sponge cakes do tend to be very sticky on the top. Then I'll put a piece of parchment paper on top and carefully flip the cake over. Remove the parchment paper that's stuck to the back of the cake and discard that. And then we'll cut the cake into 4 4-inch strips, just like this. Very simple. I'll also prepare really quickly an apricot soaking syrup. All you need is some apricot jam and a little bit of really hot water. Mix that all together and that's it. The syrup is ready. Now, I would have preferred for there to not be chunks in the apricot jam, and if I had extra time, I would have blended it. So you can blend the jam so that way all of that fruit is pureed and the jam will be nice and smooth. But I didn't have time for that today because I had to finish recording this video. And they do taste delicious in the cake anyway, so I'm leaving it up to you. Transfer one of the hazelnut layers onto your serving board, and then I also like to put some parchment paper just around the edges so that way your serving platter stays nice and clean. I'll brush the top of the cake with that apricot syrup, and then we're going to take the buttercream that we made. I like to transfer it into a pastry bag that's fitted with a star attachment and pipe it all over that layer. And then I'll do the same thing with the other 3 layers. They're gonna get soaked with the apricot syrup, then they're gonna get a layer of buttercream until we get to the final layer on top. So if you wanna be a little bit neater than me, instead of decorating the final cake layer while it's on top of the cake, it's better to decorate it while it's in the pan and then freeze it and carefully put on top. Again, I was in a hurry because I'm recording this video and a few others, and so I didn't have time to do that, so it's going to look rustic and still be so delicious. But if you're going to do it the way I am, follow along and put the final layer on top. Then we're going to take some apricot jam and spread it over the top of that layer. And then to make the fondant layer, this is not a true fondant, this is like a quick icing that we're making with 3 cups of confectioner sugar, a 1/4 cup of milk, and then 1 tablespoon of unsalted butter that I've melted. We're just gonna whisk that all together until it's nice and smooth and creamy and white. If it's looking a little bit too thick, go in and add 2 to 3 tablespoons more of milk. Whisk that all together and also transfer it to a little piping bag so that way it's easy to pipe over that jam. So we're gonna pipe this icing over the jam. Then I also melted some semi-sweet chocolate chips and put them in another little pastry bag, snip the edges off. Once the icing is on top of the cake, you're gonna wanna smooth it out. If it started to set and started to harden, you can heat up your spatula with really hot water and then carefully smooth it, or you can just leave it and it'll be fine. Now I'll pipe 4 or 5 chocolate lines along the length of the cake. And then with a toothpick, we're gonna make that beautiful Napoleon design that you usually see on Napoleons. You just drag the toothpick in the opposite side to create this feathered effect. And now I have a little bit of buttercream left over, so I'll just spread it around the sides of the cake. I also have these sliced almonds that I'll just decorate the cake with. This is totally optional. You could leave the sides bare if you want. It's just up to you. And then the cake needs to chill at this point. It needs to chill for probably an hour. You can make this the day before you're serving it and just leave it in the refrigerator overnight. And once that buttercream settles, if it's looking a little bit sloppy, you can just press everything all together with a spatula or with your hand to fix it. But once you slice it up, believe me, it will not matter if it's a little bit droopy. So I'll just stick this in the freezer and let it chill for about an hour, and then we're gonna slice it. And there you have it. The torte is ready. This hazelnut cream cake is beautiful, it's elegant, and it is pretty simple to make. You can do a lot of the steps ahead of time. If you're going to do this all in one day, it is going to take some time, but it'll be totally worth it. The sponge cake can be made a week ahead of time. Once you bake it, just let it cool to room temperature, then wrap it tightly with plastic wrap. You could even pre-slice the layers and then just put parchment paper in between each one so that way they don't stick together. Wrap them in plastic wrap. This will take less space in the freezer too. And then just freeze them for a week and then they'll be ready to use. And actually cold sponge cake layers are much easier to handle than freshly baked ones. Room temperature sponge cake bends when you handle it. It's sticky. So a cold sponge cake layer is much better. You can also make the top layer ahead of time, just decorate it and then leave it in your freezer because once it sets, it's gonna be so much easier to put on top of the cake and then you'll have a much neater presentation. When you're making dessert at home, especially when it's something like this, if it's a little rustic looking, trust me, nobody will mind. Even when I had the bakery, I ran a bakery for 10 years, people loved that the cakes looked so homemade. They didn't look like they came straight out of a factory. The pastry cream can also be made ahead of time. a day or two ahead of time. It keeps fresh in the refrigerator. And then just make the buttercream, put it all together, and it'll be assembled in like 20-30 minutes. If you can't find hazelnuts, or if they're too expensive at the supermarket at this time, then you can substitute pecans. Almonds are probably the most common substitute in this cake, and they'll taste really good in it. So those are your options. I'll put them all on the blog post. My mouth is watering. It's time to do the taste test. Perfection. The layers are buttery and nutty, and the cake is so light, but it's moist. Sponge cakes do tend to be a little bit dry, but not this one. It's perfect. The buttercream is my favorite. This is the buttercream that I use at the bakery too. I originally started with a French buttercream, but it is a little bit tricky because you're working with raw egg yolks. So I found that using pastry cream is the perfect substitute. And I do believe it's the German way of making buttercream by adding pastry cream to the buttercream. And it just makes it so silky, so creamy, not overly sweet. I think you guys are going to love this one. You can print this recipe out on the website, dimitrasdishes.com. Call some friends over, serve some coffee with this, and enjoy it. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I'll see you all next time. Yes, sis.